And we'll go ahead and get started with another edition of Art Brunch. And yes, we are continuing our series, Beauty in Art and Life. This is part 4. We're going to do one more. That's going to be next week, wrapping things up. Now, looking at the title and then the image here may be causing some cognitive dissonance among you. Well, that is because this painting by Max Beckmann is deliberately against beauty. The early 20th century witnessed what many have characterized as an assault on beauty in the visual arts, a radical departure from centuries of artistic tradition that had prioritized aesthetic harmony, idealized forms, and visual pleasure. This transformation was not merely stylistic, it represented a fundamental philosophical shift in how artists understood their role and their medium, their relationship to society. The traditional conception of beauty as a transcendent ideal gave way to art that was deliberately jarring, fragmented, and often disturbing. The term assault on beauty requires a careful explanation. Rather than suggesting a kind of coordinated attack, it describes the widespread abandonment of beauty as art's primary concern in favor of other aesthetic and intellectual goals like psychological truth, social critique, freedom of experimentation, the expression of modern alienation. This shift represented both a liberation from academic constraints as well as a response to unprecedented cultural trauma. Now, this artist you see here, Belgian painter James Ensor, is a fitting introduction to the changes that took place in art at the end of the 19th century. Art critics of his time called him a madman. Ensor grew up fascinated by the carnival masks he saw in the shop his parents ran. And though he was trained in a traditional art school, the bizarre, macabre, and grotesque seemed far more interesting to Ensor than the traditionally beautiful. His art mirrored the ideas, just beginning to spread from Germany to the rest of Europe, of a philosopher deeply interested in aesthetics and creativity. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche created a Western-wide crisis of values when he declared that God is dead in the book The Gay Science. Let me read some of it from you that you can see here. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become God simply to appear worthy of it? Now, Nietzsche was known as an ardent opponent of religion in general, but in this quote, he was merely declaring aloud what he observed in the lives of his fellow Europeans. Most of the people he saw lived as if there was no God, no matter what they professed to believe, and thus there was no transcendent beauty or good. Though he was an atheist, Nietzsche feared this would lead to a crisis of meaning and the spread of a spirit of nihilism, which of course proved to be true. This loss of belief in the divine had a profound impact that extended far beyond theology into the realm of aesthetics. For centuries, Western art had been grounded in the belief that beauty reflected divine order, that aesthetic harmony pointed toward ultimate truth and meaning. The Platonic tradition, mediated through Christianity, held that earthly beauty was a shadow of eternal beauty, and that the artist's task was to reveal this transcendent dimension. Nietzsche's critique undermined these metaphysical foundations. If there was no transcendent realm of eternal forms, no divine order to reflect, then beauty was merely a human construct rather than an objective reality. This philosophical shift opened the door to radical aesthetic experimentation, but also created what we might call an aesthetic anxiety, a fundamental uncertainty about art's purpose and even value. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power suggested that all human activities, including art making, were expressions of the fundamental drive to assert one's strength and overcome obstacles. This perspective reframed artistic creation as an act of individual assertion rather than humble service to beauty or truth. The Nietzschean artist became a creator of values rather than a discoverer of pre-existing ones. This philosophical framework encouraged artists to break with tradition, to forge new aesthetic languages, and to prioritize originality and personal expression over adherence to established standards of beauty. Now take this traditional religious motif that you're seeing now and examine what James Ensor has done with it. Just give you a minute before I move on. The Expressionist movement in Germany in particular drew heavily on this Nietzschean emphasis on subjective truth and emotional authenticity. German Expressionism, developing in the years before and after World War I, explicitly rejected the pursuit of beauty in favor of emotional authenticity. Artists like Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Edvard Munch, Emil Knoll deliberately distorted forms, using harsh colors and employed crude brushwork to convey psychological states rather than visual pleasure. Kirchner's Street Dresden exemplifies this approach. The painting depicts urban pedestrians as angular, mask-like figures moving through a space rendered in aggressive yellows and greens. The deliberate crudeness of the drawing and the jarring color relationships create an atmosphere of anxiety and alienation that would have been impossible within traditional aesthetic frameworks. The Last Supper by Emil Nolde is a powerful expressionist interpretation of the classic event, depicted in so many artworks we're familiar with. Instead of traditional iconography like that depicted during the Renaissance, Nolde emphasizes human emotion, spiritual intensity, and complex psychology over polished realism and idealized beauty. Expressionists argued that the urge to abstraction represented a more fundamental human impulse than the classical desire for beauty and harmony. Artists like Edvard Munch sought to express psychological authenticity rather than beautiful imagery. Franz Marc's later works, particularly those created just before his death in World War I, showed a progression from his earlier, more beautiful animal paintings towards something like this, increasingly abstract and violent compositions. This work, Fighting Forms, presents a battlefield of abstract shapes and collision, rendered in colors that shift from the natural toward the apocalyptic. Nietzsche's words about beauty describe well this change in artistic perspective. He said, "There are no beautiful surfaces without a terrible depth." And is the world really beautified by the fact that man thinks it beautiful? He has humanized it, that is all. In other words, there is no inherent beauty in the world, only what we choose to impose on the world. While Nietzsche himself sought to overcome nihilism through the creation of new values, his critique of traditional metaphysics inadvertently contributed to nihilistic tendencies in modern culture. Many artists absorbed his critique of traditional values without embracing his positive program of value creation. The result was often a profound sense of meaninglessness that manifested in art that seemed to reject not only traditional beauty, but any coherent aesthetic program. Marc Chagall's The Drunkard presents a figure in psychological disarray, floating in impossible space with distorted proportions that emphasize the subject's mental state over physical beauty. Giorgio de Chirico's The Song of Love presents a kind of disturbing juxtaposition of classical sculpture, which we normally associate with beauty, with modern industrial objects and mysterious shadows that creates an atmosphere of inexplicable anxiety rather than aesthetic pleasure. The precise rendering serves to make the impossible combination of elements rather unsettling, more so at least than beautiful. In addition to the spread of a nihilistic view of life, World War I came along and shattered the optimistic belief in human progress and rational civilization that had characterized the late 19th century. The unprecedented mechanized slaughter of millions revealed the barbarism lurking beneath the veneer of European culture. For many artists, the traditional language of beauty seemed not merely inadequate, it seemed obscene in the face of such carnage. Artists who experienced the war firsthand produced works that deliberately rejected beautiful representation in favor of traumatic authenticity. Otto Dix, a German artist who served in the trenches, created a series of etchings titled The War that depicted the brutal realities of combat with unflinching honesty. Works like Stormtroopers Advancing Under Gas showed skeletal figures moving through a hellish landscape, their humanity barely recognizable beneath gas masks and military equipment. The war created what we might term an aesthetic crisis of representation. You see, how could artists continue to create beautiful objects like this when beauty itself seemed complicit in the lies that had led to mass destruction? The genteel world of academic art, with its mythological subjects and idealized figures and landscapes, appeared grotesquely disconnected from contemporary reality. Paul Nash, a British war artist, transformed the pastoral tradition of English landscape painting into something nightmarish. His work, We Are Making a New World, presents a devastated battlefield where blasted tree stumps reach toward an ominous sky like accusing fingers. The ironic title underscores the bitter contrast between progressive rhetoric and destructive reality. Max Beckmann's triptych, The Night, responded to the violence and social chaos of post-war Germany with a composition that fragmented and distorted the human form. This is the central panel. It depicts a scene of torture and brutality, rendered in a deliberately crude style that rejected the refinements of traditional painting in favor of raw, expressive power. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner's self-portrait as a soldier shows the artist in military uniform with an amputated hand. His face a mask of psychological trauma, rendered in harsh colors and angular forms that, well, reject any attempt at a heroic or beautiful representation. The Dadaist movement, emerging simultaneously in Zurich and New York and Berlin during World War I, represented the most radical rejection of traditional aesthetic values. Dadaists like Marcel Duchamp created works that were deliberately anti-aesthetic, challenging not only beautiful art, but the very concept of art itself. Duchamp's fountain, a urinal signed R. Mutt, and presented as sculpture, represented the logical endpoint of the critique of aesthetic values. By declaring that anything could be art simply by virtue of being placed in an artistic context, Duchamp challenged not only traditional notions of beauty, but the very concept of aesthetic judgment itself. In this work, with a long and very odd descriptive title, Duchamp presented a complex allegorical machine rendered in glass panels. The work's deliberate, incomprehensible nature and its mechanical imagery rejected both traditional subject matter, traditional media, and any aesthetic sensibility. Hannah Hawk's photomontages, such as this one, and talk about an enigmatic title. Go ahead and read it for yourself. This work created chaotic compositions from fragments of photographs and newspapers and advertisements. These works reflected the fragmentation of modern experience, while rejecting the unified compositions that had been so central to traditional aesthetic theory. Dadaist manifestos, such as Tristan Tzar's Dada Manifesto, explicitly rejected coherent aesthetic theory in favor of contradiction, chance, and anti-rationalism. This rejection of systematic thinking extended to the rejection of beauty as a systematic aesthetic category. André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto advocated for automatic drawing and writing as a means of bypassing conscious aesthetic judgment to access unconscious truth. This approach prioritized psychological authenticity over aesthetic beauty, often producing images that were disturbing or incomprehensible rather than visually pleasing. Cubism. It was less explicitly anti-aesthetic than Dadaism or Expressionism. Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon shocked viewers with its angular, mask-like faces and fragmented bodies that seemed to reject centuries of careful study of human proportion and beauty. The influence of African masks, which Picasso encountered in Paris, brought African aesthetic values into direct confrontation with European traditions. Cubism, which followed from this, created a new visual language that prioritized intellectual understanding over sensuous pleasure. Chaim Soutin's The Carcass of Beef depicts a flayed animal carcass in thick, expressionistic brushstrokes that emphasize decay and death. The painting's visceral impact deliberately challenges our aesthetic comfort zones, forcing confrontation with mortality and violence. George Grote's The City presents urban life as a nightmarish carnival of grotesque figures and violent encounters. Grotz's Eclipse of the Sun depicts German society as populated by monstrous figures, bloated capitalists, skeletal workers, and predatory military officers, rendered in deliberately repulsive detail. Otto Dix's portrait of the journalist Sylvia von Harden transforms portraiture into social critique, representing the subject as a harsh, angular figure with exaggerated masculine features, cigarette dangling from thin lips, monocle reflecting cold light. The deliberate ugliness serves to comment on Weimar Germany's social decadence. And this troubling work by Otto Dix. It shows three mutilated veterans of the First World War playing a card game named Skat, which was very popular in Germany at the time. Now, the artist could have given a semblance of beauty by painting these horribly scarred veterans in a setting and pose that would honor their sacrifice. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he wants to amplify the horror and ugliness of the war by creating a grotesque scene, inciting not sympathy, but horror in us. Francis Picabbia's I See Again in Memory My Udni reduces human figures to mechanical abstractions of pistons and gears, eliminating any trace of human warmth or organic beauty. His portrait of a young American girl in a state of nudity consists entirely of a spark plug, the figure in the middle, reducing feminine beauty to industrial machinery. Egon Schille's Death and the Maiden presents emaciated, contorted figures locked in an embrace that suggests both love but also death. The artist's characteristic angular style and sickly color palette create images of human relationships that are deeply disturbing rather than romantically beautiful. While these movements succeeded in expanding the possibilities of artistic expression and creating new aesthetic languages, the question remains whether they successfully replaced traditional beauty with viable alternatives. Now, some works, like Picasso's Guernica, achieved a kind of what we might call terrible beauty through their powerful expression of human suffering. But other art remained primarily historical curiosities, interesting as documents of a cultural crisis, rather than as successful artworks that we enjoy looking at. The Italian Futurist movement, led by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, explicitly celebrated violence, speed, and modern technology, while rejecting traditional beauty as outdated and irrelevant. Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto declared, listen to this, declared war on museums, libraries, and academies, calling for art that would reflect the energy and dynamism of modern industrial life. Let me read from this manifesto or declaration, numbers 7 and 9. There is no more beauty except in struggle, no masterpiece without the stamp of aggressiveness. Poetry should be a violent assault against unknown forces to summon them to lie down at the feet of man. And then number 9, we will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and the scorn of woman. Pretty brutal. Carlo Cara's Funeral of the Anarchist Galli depicted political violence through fragmented, intersecting planes of color and form. The painting's deliberately chaotic composition reflected the Italian Futurist celebration of conflict and destruction as necessary forces of social renewal. The artists in the rest of Europe seemed less interested in social renewal and more interested in depicting the ugliness within human beings. English painter Francis Bacon's works are often described as misanthropic. They certainly represent a rejection of beauty, both inner and outer, in human beings. Now, here's an example from sculpture. This work by Albert Giacometti presents the female form as a bronze insect-like creature, violently fragmented, sexually explicit in its vulnerability. The sculpture's sharp edges and aggressive sprawl reject any notion of feminine beauty or dignity. So this rejection of beauty in early modern art had profound cultural consequences, influencing not only subsequent artistic development, but also broader attitudes towards aesthetic value, cultural tradition, and the role of art in society. The democratic expansion of aesthetic possibilities came at the cost of shared aesthetic standards. We are now continuing to experience the fruit of this fragmentation of cultural authority. While some philosophers and artists have attempted to rehabilitate beauty as a central aesthetic category, others, like Louise Bourgeois, have continued to explore the possibilities opened up by its initial rejection. The tension between these approaches continues to animate contemporary aesthetic debate. The early 20th century's assault on beauty was not merely a stylistic rebellion, but a fundamental transformation of art's relationship to society, philosophy, and human experience. Driven by philosophical crisis, cultural trauma, and revolutionary optimism, artists developed new aesthetic languages that prioritized psychological truth, social critique, and creative freedom over traditional concepts of beauty. Now, the specific artworks we examine, from Marcel Duchamp's nonsensical ready-mades to Otto Dix's disturbing war etchings, to Francis Picabbia's and Francis Bacon's apparent attack on the human form, they all demonstrate the various strategies artists employed to challenge traditional aesthetic values and address the unprecedented conditions of modern life. While these works often rejected traditional beauty, many achieved their own form of aesthetic power through their uncompromising honesty, formal innovation, and cultural relevance. The legacy of this period remains contested. Some view it as art's liberation from restrictive academic traditions and its emergence as a force for social and psychological transformation, but others see it as a tragic loss of shared cultural values and aesthetic standards that has led to contemporary art's fragmentation and popular irrelevance. What remains clear is that the early 20th century established the terms of aesthetic debate that continue to shape contemporary art and culture. The tension between beauty and truth, tradition and innovation, elite and popular culture that animated the period's revolutionary movements continues to define artistic practice and cultural criticism today. The assault on beauty was not merely a historical episode, but the opening battle in an ongoing struggle to define art's role in modern society. Whether future artists and societies will find ways to reconcile the insights of modern aesthetic experiment with renewed appreciation for beauty remains an open question, and a topic I will examine at our next art brunch. What cannot be disputed is that the early 20th century's radical transformation of artistic possibility permanently changed how we understand the relationship between art, beauty, and human experience. And that transformation continues to shape our cultural landscape more than a century later. Well, thank you very much for your attention, presence. Very curious to hear your own reflections on this topic. So I open the floor up to you now. Don't forget to unmute yourself and then mute yourself back when you're done. And if you need me to move to any other slide previous to this one, I'll do so. All right, the floor is now open. Don't be shy.